I live in a small countryside town with my mother. The town itself is very quiet and isolated, and there are very few people living here to begin with. One of my daily routines is going out for a run early in the morning, and I've been doing this for years. But a few months ago, an incident happened, after which I completely stopped running through the woods altogether. I woke up at around 5 a.m. It was still dark outside, and the sun hadn't fully risen yet. I put on my tracksuit, grabbed my headphones, and then headed outside for my usual morning run. It was as quiet as ever since everyone was still asleep at this point. I jogged through the quiet streets and narrow roads around the town, and eventually, I made my way all the way up to the edge of the woods. Our town is located at an elevation, and it sits right next to a dense forest that stretches for miles. My routine was to jog through the streets and loop back to my house, but occasionally, I would take a detour and extend my run by running through the woods. I didn't do it all the time, but I did it when I felt like it. Unfortunately, this was one of those days. So instead of turning back toward the town, I ran straight ahead and entered the forest. The trees were extremely tall and dense, so even though the sunlight was slowly starting to rise, the woods was still pretty dark and shadowy at this point. I continued jogging through the trail, listening to music and focusing on my run. But after a few minutes, I thought I noticed something move from the corner of my eye. So while running, I turned my head slightly toward the left, and I saw a figure standing just a few feet away from me, behind the trees. I immediately stopped running and looked toward the figure. At first, I couldn't fully make out what I was looking at because of how dark the woods still were. But after staring at it for a few more seconds, I realized that the figure was actually a woman. She was dressed entirely in black clothing, and most of her face was hidden behind her hair. But what unsettled me the most was the fact that she wasn't moving at all. She was just standing there, completely motionless, in the middle of the woods, staring off into the distance. I don't know what she was looking at since it was just trees and woods around, so there was really nothing to look at. I was extremely weirded out by this. This seemed completely out of place. It was just a random person standing in the middle of a dark forest, completely motionless, especially at this hour. I felt uneasy, so I decided it was best if I get away from this place. So without saying anything, I turned and slowly jogged away in the other direction. Eventually, I reached a small clearing deeper into the forest. I was tired, so I took out my water bottle and sat down on a fallen tree branch to drink some water. But even while resting, I was still thinking about that woman from before and just how bizarre that whole situation was. And as I sat there, I suddenly heard something from behind me. I turned around to look at what it was, but I didn't see anything. I thought it was probably just an animal or something since I was in the forest after all. I stood up to leave and continue my run. But then, that's when I noticed something that immediately froze me in my place. Just a few feet away from me, behind the trees, I saw what looked like the head of a person peeking out from behind a tree trunk. I stared at it for a few more seconds, trying to process what I was even seeing. And then, my stomach dropped as I realized that it was the same woman that I had seen before, hiding behind the tree and looking straight at me. A cold chill ran through my spine. I thought she hadn't noticed me before, but clearly I was wrong. She had seen me, And what's even more disturbing is the fact that she had followed me all the way up to this point. And just as I was trying to process all this, the woman slowly came out from behind the tree and stood right in front of it. And this is when I realized what she had been holding in her hand the entire time. The woman was holding a large butcher's cleaver in her right hand. I've probably never been this scared in my life. For a brief second, I looked away in the opposite direction, trying to figure out which way the trail was. And when I looked back, pure panic took over my body as I saw that she was now running straight toward me with the cleaver in her hand. Without thinking, I turned and bolted straight in the opposite direction. I ran faster than I probably ever ran in my life. I was crashing into branches and hitting sticks and rocks while running, but I didn't stop for a second. At that point, adrenaline had completely taken over my body, and all I could think of was getting out of those woods and away from that woman. Eventually, I saw the end of the tree line and charged right through it, exiting the forest and back onto the streets. I immediately turned toward my neighborhood and sprinted all the way back to my house. While running, I looked back for a second and saw that there was no one behind me now. But I didn't stop though. I kept running until I finally reached the footsteps of my house and practically collapsed onto the front porch, trying to catch my breath. I sat on the porch, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, while constantly looking around to make sure nobody had followed me home. Eventually though, once I was able to calm myself down, I realized that I'd probably lost her back in the woods. But I was still severely shaken. To this day, I still don't know what that woman was doing out there, or why she suddenly even started chasing me like that. A part of me thinks that she was probably some deranged person, living somewhere deep into the forest. Whatever the case was, I knew I was never going back into those woods again. I still go running every morning, but now I only stick to the streets around town. There's absolutely no way I'm ever stepping foot inside that forest again. I grew up with my grandfather, living on his farm in a small secluded town. The farm itself was huge, and so growing up there, I naturally learned to do all the chores we do on a farm. It was hard work, but it taught me a lot of valuable things that helped me on later in my life. But when I was 18 years old, I experienced something on the farm that has unfortunately stuck with me ever since. It was a quiet evening on the farm, just like any other night. I was preparing dinner with my grandfather when he asked me to grab his bag that he had forgotten in the barn. So I quickly got up and headed outside the house toward the barn. As I walked, I remembered the weather that night was unusually cold. I reached the barn and grabbed the bag from inside, and then I started walking back toward the house. But just as I stepped outside the barn, I noticed something move out into the cornfield. The cornfield was massive and extremely dense, and it was nighttime, so it was hard to tell what I was looking at. But as I stayed at it for a few more seconds, I realized what I was looking at. There was a faint dark figure moving slowly through the cornfield. And as soon as I saw it, I panicked and ran straight back to the house. I rushed over to my grandfather and told him that there was a person walking around in the cornfield. My grandfather immediately grabbed his shotgun and flashlight, and then he quickly went outside to confront the person. I stood outside on the front porch and waited for him to come back as he went into the cornfield. He finally came back after some time, but he said that he couldn't find anyone there. The field is huge, so obviously the person could have easily hidden anywhere. We assumed that whoever it was probably had just ran away by this point. But just as a precautionary measure, we locked all doors and windows that night, just to make sure that we were safe from anything dangerous. The next morning, my grandfather went back outside and looked deeper into the cornfield. But strangely enough, he couldn't find anything, and there was no sign of anyone being there last night. Still, though, we brushed it off, saying that it was probably just some random trespasser that had ran away after seeing my grandfather come out with a shotgun. We had dealt with trespassers in the past, so I guess it wasn't too unusual. But that night, something similar happened again. I was sitting outside with my grandfather on the porch when I randomly glanced out toward the barn in the distance. And that's when I noticed someone standing near the barn. I pointed it out to my grandfather, and he quickly turned to take a look. It was pretty obvious from where he sat that there was a dark figure standing right next to the barn. Naturally, my grandfather immediately got up and rushed over to the barn. Trespassers on farms could be dangerous sometimes, since they occasionally tried stealing equipment and even livestock, so it was important to confront them. But what was unsettling was what my grandfather told me when he got back. He looked at me with a very confused look on his face, and he said that he had looked all over the barn, but he couldn't find anyone there. There were no tracks and no sign of anyone even being there last night. It didn't make any sense. It had literally just taken my grandfather just a few seconds to reach the barn after spotting the figure. Even if he assumed that the person escaped, it would have been virtually impossible for them to escape so quickly, especially without even being seen. We both sat there in silence, wondering how that was even possible. We had brushed off what had happened last night, but this time was different, because we both knew for a fact that we had clearly seen someone standing near the barn. How that person vanished so quickly, that was the concerning part. Eventually though, it got late, so we went back inside and locked everything again for the night. The next night, I was supposed to be alone on the farm. My grandfather had to go meet up with someone in the city, so he was gone for the night, which meant that I had to take care of the entire farm myself. Normally, being alone on the farm wouldn't have bothered me as much since I was already used to it, but after everything that had happened the previous 2 nights, I was definitely uneasy. I remember going to sleep earlier that night since I was extremely tired from all the work that I had to do the entire day. I woke up at around 2 a.m. I remember feeling extremely thirsty, so I went downstairs to the kitchen to get some water. I walked toward the kitchen and poured water out of the dispenser. But as soon as I turned to leave, I stopped dead in my tracks as I glanced through the kitchen window. There was a man standing right outside the kitchen window, staring directly at me. It was so sudden that I almost yelled out in horror. He wasn't moving at all. He was just standing there, completely still, looking straight at me. I was genuinely scared at this point. But at the same time, I knew I was responsible for the farm tonight. I couldn't just let this guy walk around our property without doing anything. So I took a deep breath and calmed myself down. And then I grabbed a baseball bat next to the dispenser, and then I ran straight outside to confront the person. But what I saw next honestly terrified me more than anything. There was no one outside the house. No one was standing near the window. I looked around the entire property, desperately searching for whoever was out there, but there was no one. That was the moment when genuine fear really started settling in for me. I had literally seen this guy standing right outside my window just a few seconds ago, but now he was just gone. I'm not one to believe in the paranormal, but even I knew that it was physically impossible for anyone to run away that fast. I like to think I'm a very mentally strong person, but this incident definitely shook me. When my grandfather finally came back, I told him what had happened. Naturally, he was just as shaken as I was. But strangely enough though, that was the last I ever saw of that person. After that night, we never saw that figure ever again on the farm. Whatever it was that we had been seeing around the farm completely disappeared. Even now, years later, I still think about those nights sometimes, and I wonder exactly what we had witnessed out there. A part of me wants answers, but another part of me honestly just wants to forget this entire incident even happened. A few years ago, me and my 3 friends, Mark, Steve, and Jeff, decided to spend a weekend together at a rural farmhouse. The farmhouse belonged to Mark's uncle, and it was located far outside the city in a quiet countryside. Mark told us that his uncle barely visited the place anymore, which meant we had the entire place to ourselves. I remember the trip there was actually pretty fun for us. It was just us 4 guys, goofing around and just having the time of our lives. We arrived sometime during the afternoon. We spent the entire day unpacking our stuff and settling into the house. The place itself was old, but it was pretty cozy, and because it was located so far away from everything, the entire area felt peaceful and quiet. After setting everything up, we prepared some food for ourselves, and then we basically just hung out for the rest of the day. As night approached though, the atmosphere around us changed completely. The field became much darker, the wind started getting colder, and the surroundings looked almost pitch black at this point. At some point, while we were sitting outside, Steve jokingly suggested that we should all go out and explore the forest together. There was actually a huge open field that surrounded the entire property, but directly behind the farmhouse, there was a massive dense forest that stretched for miles. So Steve was basically joking about going into the dense forest in all this darkness. At first, we all just laughed it off, but eventually, after enough joking around, we actually got serious about it, and after convincing each other, the 4 of us grabbed our flashlights and decided to actually do it. So we crossed the field behind the farmhouse and eventually entered the woods. I remember that the deeper we walked into the forest, the quieter everything became. Mark joked about how this felt like the beginning of a horror movie, and honestly, he wasn't too far off. After walking around for 20 minutes or so, Jeff suddenly pointed his flashlight ahead of us and told us to look in front. We all stopped for a second and looked straight ahead, and we saw that there was an old broken down wooden cabin between the dense trees in front of us. The cabin looked abandoned and half rotten. Some of the windows were broken, and the wood itself looked extremely old. None of us had any idea that there was actually a cabin out here, so naturally, we got curious. We gestured to one another, and then slowly, we approached the cabin together. Honestly, looking back at it, I remember that the closer we got to the cabin, the more unsettling it felt. Steve jokingly called out if anyone was there, but obviously, the place was deserted, so there was no response. We opened the broken old door and stepped inside the cabin. The inside of the cabin looked abandoned. There was old furniture covered in dust, broken shelves, and just random junk scattered everywhere across the floor. I remember we were just casually walking around inside the cabin with our flashlights, looking for anything remotely interesting for us. But then, all of a sudden, we heard a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere inside the cabin. All four of us immediately froze in our places, and just as we did, the tapping sound immediately stopped as well. We looked at each other, confused at what the heck we had just heard. We thought that maybe it was a wild animal or a loose wood inside the cabin moving around or something. The forest around us had become completely still, and for a few seconds, none of us said anything. And then, the tapping sound started again. Except this time, it wasn't coming from one place. The tapping was coming from several places inside the cabin. My heart immediately started beating out of my chest, and I was almost too scared to even move. The four of us immediately looked at each other, and then, without saying a word, we rushed outside the cabin, terrified at what the heck was going on. We nervously looked around the cabin, flashing our flashlights in all directions to see who was tapping on the cabin. But we didn't see anyone. There was no one around the cabin. The area was completely empty, and the forest itself was dead silent. Mark immediately said that we should get out of here, and we all agreed with him. But just before we could leave, something happened that downright terrifies me even to this day. We heard a loud scream coming from inside the cabin, echoing through the entire forest. It sounded like a person screaming in absolute terror. The sound was so loud and terrifying that it almost made me throw up on spot. And so, without wasting another second, we turned around and sprinted straight for the tree line away from the cabin. I remember hearing our footsteps pounding against the ground as we sprinted away in horror. We desperately ran as fast as we could, eventually crossing the tree line all the way back to the house and shutting the door behind us. We all collapsed on the floor, sweating and gasping for air. This was quite literally the most terrifying moment of my life. We were completely shocked at what we had just heard. There was no one out there in the woods, and yet we had heard several tappings coming from inside the cabin, and then there was that terrifying scream we had heard. It didn't make any sense. None of us slept properly that night, and weirdly enough, we didn't really talk much about what happened either. The next morning, Mark called his uncle and asked him about the cabin in the woods, and what he told us made the entire thing even creepier. He said that he knew exactly which cabin we were talking about, and that apparently there was a rumor floating around that an old man used to live there alone years ago. But that man had disappeared one night, and he was never found after that. After hearing that, none of us even dared to go back into those woods again, and we basically spent the entire weekend inside the house. I still think about that cabin and that scream sometimes, and to this day, I still have no explanation for what we heard inside that cabin that night.